We come today to a vitally important passage in the structure of the Gospel. It either should be regarded as finishing off the Jesus training his disciples bit that I've called Act 2 of the Gospel story, or it's the first bit of Acts 3 where Jesus is directing himself towards the climax of his own ministry. One way or another, at this point, the story is taking on a new direction. So if you'd like to read first Mark 10, verses 46 to 52. 46. They came to Jericho. What you're supposed to hear there is that they came to Jericho as in passing through Jericho on their way to Jerusalem. Take the warning at the end of John's Gospel that we should assume that what we read of in the Gospel's accounts is a fraction of what Jesus actually did and said. So presumably coming to Jericho will have occupied him for a while, but we're only told of one incident, and that was as they were leaving. That incident then centres around this person called Bartimaeus. This is the only incident in the Gospels in which we're told the name of someone that Jesus healed. Mark tells us that his name means son of Timaeus. Well, it's possible that rather than just explaining the meaning of the Aramaic name, that means that Mark is telling us that this beggar was the son of Timaeus. You might have heard of Timaeus, and it has that sort of flavour to it. It's possible then that by the time that Mark wrote, this Timaeus was a believer, possibly known to some of Mark's earlier readers. We don't know. We're sort of putting supposition upon supposition, but it's not a daft suggestion to make. This Bartimaeus was begging. This was his means of livelihood. He must have heard the commotion and presumably wondered what was happening. Luke has it that he asked what the fuss was about, and he was told Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. That answer must have communicated with Bartimaeus on various levels. One was that it called to his mind what he'd already heard about Jesus. In the Lord's short stay in Jericho, there hadn't already been time really for his reputation to have built up. It must be that his reputation had preceded him, so that when Bartimaeus received the brief information that it was Jesus, that called to his mind some of the things he'd already heard about Jesus, and that immediately challenged him as to his own attitude to Jesus. Another level on which this approaches Bartimaeus is that there's an urgency in the information. Jesus of Nazareth is passing by is a message which says he's passing by at this moment, but when this moment has passed, so will Jesus have passed. So if you miss him in this moment, you will have missed him. That reminds me of the call in Isaiah: seek the Lord while he is near, call on him while he is to be found. Don't miss the moment. Well, the reaction of Bartimaeus to this complex communication was quick and clear. In verse 7, he calls out to him, Son of David. Jesus was a common name. Which Jesus it was is clarified as Jesus the Nazarene. But Bartimaeus himself goes further in addressing Jesus as Son of David. That's tantamount to calling him Jesus, Messiah. The disciples seem to have been following Jesus' instructions not to talk to people in terms of Jesus being the Messiah. But what we've called the messianic secret is in the process of breaking down. The large crowd seemed to have gathered around Jesus and the disciples as they passed through Jericho. Presumably the Bush Telegraph had put it about that they were on their way to Jerusalem, and the people of Jericho would have known enough about Jesus, enough about this talk of his being Messiah, that they'd got some inkling that his going to Jerusalem was his meeting up with his destiny in some way. That made them curious, so they tagged along as these men passed through their city. It's also possible that at least some of the crowd around Jesus had, like Jesus and the disciples, started this journey up in Galilee, going to Jerusalem for Passover. What we've read about the people of Galilee would suggest that any who found themselves on the same journey as Jesus would have been more than glad to join themselves to his little group. If they followed him all the way to Jerusalem, these followers from Galilee could have formed the basis of the crowd who greeted him so enthusiastically as he made his way up the final hill on a donkey. Verse 7. Bartimaeus, it says, shouted to establish contact with Jesus. Shouting isn't very British, really. Not British in a religious context. But in the Middle East, there are no such reservations. In the Old Testament, shouting to God is quite important. I think, for instance, of the time in Ezra chapter 3, when the foundation of the new temple was laid, and it says, all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord. It would have been more British to have organised some music and appointing some composer to put a festival piece together and getting Westminster Abbey Choir to perform it. But that wasn't how it was when the temple foundation was laid. The people there spontaneously realised that big praise was called for right there, right then, and they did it, and shouting was how they did it, even at the risk of seeming uncouth. Just so, Bartimaeus has to communicate with Jesus right there and then. He could not risk it coming over half-heartedly. He couldn't risk Jesus not hearing or not taking any notice of him. So he shouted. Verse 48. People told him to shut up. Who were they? Well, Luke helps us again. Luke says that the people who told him to shut up were those who led the way. Presumably, these were the locals who'd found themselves leading the town's welcoming response to Jesus. They were the people who were moving with Jesus through the crowds. They were the people who called on the crowd to make way for Jesus. It might, of course, be that even the disciples were included amongst those who told Bartimaeus to shut up. Not long before, they told the parents of little children not to bother Jesus. So it's conceivable that they were among those who, in the hype of the moment, tried to sweep this blind beggar out of the way. Those who had any inkling that what was happening was that the Messiah was approaching the final moments of his arrival at Jerusalem, they could well have thought that being waylaid by a blind beggar didn't give the appropriate air of majesty to the occasion. At any rate, it seems we ought to assume that those who rebuked Bartimaeus were in some sense followers of Jesus. So what was going on in their minds? Was it, we're having a good time and we don't want it spoiled by having to cope with you? Was it, we're in the in crowd, you are very clearly an out person, so stay away? Was it even, you're only a beggar, we don't want anything to do with you? In today's situation, we are the followers of Jesus, and it makes you wonder how many irrelevant messages we send to people outside our company. We've all come across people who've been on the receiving end of those messages, people who are reticent to come to church because they don't like dressing up, and we've given them the message that they ought to dress up if they do come to church. People who stay away because they think they're in the wrong social grouping, or those who hold back because they've noticed some of the sins of those of us who come. In radio terms, back in the days of AM broadcasts before FM and DAB, that would have counted as noise. You know, the snap, crackle, and pop, which is irrelevant to the message being transmitted, but which tends to mask it. Some noise is inevitable, but who is content with how little we transmit that makes it hard for outsiders to approach Jesus? Well, still in verse 48, good for Bartimaeus, he shouted all the more. Well done, that man. Here's a man who has, for some reason, such a clear image of Jesus that he's not going to be put off by the people around Jesus. People like that are gold to the church. They are precious jewels adorning the building. It's not necessarily very comfortable for them, because once they're in the church, they usually carry on with a profound dislike for the noise which the church itself transmits. You should understand that their voice is prophetic, helping on a daily basis to take the church back to Jesus. Verse 49, Jesus stopped. He had the adulation of the crowd, but he heard the personal appeal of this one man's voice penetrating that noise. And he said, call him. So they did, promptly. The people who'd rebuked him quickly turned to encourage him when Jesus sets the pace. It's almost depressing how ready these people are to change tack. It reminds you of the change soon to take place in the other direction, when one day crowds would receive Jesus into Jerusalem with hosannas, and within a week the city's welcome had turned into shouting, crucify him, when a few agents provocateurs had done their business. Paul speaks of these two people as children, tossed about like a little boat in a storm at sea. That's Ephesians 4:14. As we mature as Christians, we come to see people as Jesus sees them, and there isn't then such an embarrassing contrast between how we see them and what is revealed when Jesus steps in. But as we're not yet fully mature, the difference is still there, but one hopes it's not as large or as embarrassing as it perhaps once was. Verse 50, no sooner said than done. Verse 51, Jesus then asks what deserves by most people's reckoning to be called a silly question. What do you want me to do for you? Surely it was obvious. Here was a blind beggar shouting at the top of his voice to Jesus, the man who got the best ever healing ministry. Surely it was obvious that he wanted to be healed. Well, perhaps it was obvious. But an issue which had to be faced was who would take responsibility for the man's healing? Was Jesus expected to march into this man's life and take over decisions like that? Or was the man himself to be given the dignity of retaining his own responsibility for saying what should happen to him? Jesus is in no doubt. The man must be given his own dignity. It's his life, so what happens to him must be on his say-so. Many years ago, my wife and I worked in the Samaritans in Romford, near where we lived. We had there a very clear code of conduct, part of which was that we could never take third-party calls. We could never make calls because we thought it would help a client. We could never take an initiative on behalf of clients, like contacting the social services, because we thought they could do with help. All we could do was to advise the clients themselves as to what they might do. Everything had to be done to have them retain the responsibility for their own lives. Almost as many years ago, I remember being involved just before Christmas one year in a concert in the Cheshire home in Hitchin near us. The way that home was organised was a lesson for us all. It was run by a committee of the residents themselves, and it was that committee, for instance, which employed the staff. The residents were not patients. A patient is by definition someone who allows things to be done to them. The word patient comes from the same Latin root as passive. The residents in that home were supposed to be active. Despite their many handicaps, which were obvious, they were required to take responsibility for their own affairs. I really liked that. There is, of course, one very good reason why Bartimaeus had to take this responsibility for himself. He was a blind beggar. Begging was his means of livelihood, and as such, his blindness was his principal asset. Remove his blindness, and he no longer had the same call on people's charity. Removing his blindness was putting him out of a job, taking him at whatever age he was, and demanding that he should begin a totally new career at zero notice. You can't take that sort of decision for someone else. Even Jesus can't. So the silly question had to be asked, and it had to be Bartimaeus who answered it. So he did. On the whole, addressing Jesus as rabbi, like Bartimaeus did here, is restricted to the disciples. Perhaps recording this is another signal from Mark that Bartimaeus and possibly his father Timaeus were known believers by the time that Mark wrote his story. Verse 52, bang! No sooner said than done. No sooner had Bartimaeus given the go-ahead than Jesus did the healing. Bartimaeus had the need to decide, but Jesus had the ability and the desire to heal, and therefore it happened. There's a nice little one here. Mark's words are usually translated, your faith has healed you, but they could just as readily be translated, your faith has saved you. I guarantee it was that meaning that was prominent in Mark's mind when he wrote this story. He followed Jesus along the road, it said. At this stage, this meant that he joined in the crowd who were tagging along with Jesus as they left the city. The way that Mark has used the man's name suggests that he became a follower of Jesus in a much fuller way. Not just tagging along behind him, I mean, but devoting his life to being a follower of Jesus. So, what about us? Number one, take a good look at the man's clear and strong intention to get through to Jesus, despite all the noise, because he sensed that in Jesus he could find life. Be encouraged by that, and in a measure, I suppose, be reproved. Every single one of us has far more information about Jesus than that Bartimaeus had. Far more reason to know that in Jesus we can find life. And yet, are we as keen as he was? Allow this man's boldness to encourage you. Number two, I do have a bit more to say about verse 51. You come to church, putting yourself out to some degree to come and seek the mercy of God. And in one way or another, you're in effect saying, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Okay. Then Jesus looks you straight in the face and he asks, what do you want me to do for you. And at that point you might splutter and protest that, well, to someone like the Lord, it surely must be obvious. He can see what you need. And he takes that rudery from you and gently replies, I didn't ask what you need. I can see that. I asked what you want. Or on what have you set your heart? What are you really looking for when you come to me today? What is there that if you find that you've got it, you will then know that you've got what you came for? How do you answer that sort of question as the Lord asks you? To get through to the sort of answer that Jesus will recognize, we often have to find our way through something of a fog. There's one kind of fog caused by people who have taught carelessly about humility. The effect of that fog is to make you feel ashamed to ask for anything for yourself. There's another kind of fog which reinforces that one, which is a general attitude of liberal humanism and which prepares you for thinking that all the highest issues concern the good that you do for other people. Well, if you manage to get through those fogs, what sort of answer to this question would Jesus recognize? Well, I've got a little checklist for you concerning what Jesus wants you to want at the outset of your journey with him. What about this checklist? Number 1, I want you to be my Saviour. Number 2, I want you to be my Lord. Number 3, I want you to baptize me with your Spirit. And then concerning the main central part of your journey, number 4, I want you to heal me in body and in mind. Number 5, I want you to help me give glory to God in worship and in my life. Or number 6, I want you to help me bring my wife and children and, fill in the spaces there, to know you and love you. And lastly, concerning the end of this earthly part of your journey with him, number 7, I want you to reassure me of my own safe passage through death into the rest of eternal life. Well, this is the end of Acts 2 in the Gospel, in which Jesus has been addressing himself principally to the disciples. I wouldn't be surprised if, as Mark included the incident with Bartimaeus in his story, he felt that, in a way, the whole of Acts 2 had been about healing the blindness of the 12. I'm sure, anyway, that there have been plenty of sermons on this text which have taken that line. Our next study will begin Acts 3, in which Jesus is addressing himself not to the disciples, but to Jerusalem and its leaders. The Lord bless you.